Welcome to the latest session in CADIT's COVID-19 webinar series. I'm Heather Logan, Executive Strategy Lead at CADIT, also known as the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health. I'm moderating the webinar today from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I truly want to thank the generations of people who have taken care of this land over the years. And I encourage everyone participating today and to encourage those you know to think about where you are located and to give thanks to the people who've been stewards to the land that we are privileged to enjoy. Please encourage your friends and family to do the same. So about our topic today, thank you for joining. Last August, CADIT hosted a webinar on the unprecedented push to develop a COVID-19 vaccine. Vaccines were seen and still are seen as the best hope for ending the pandemic, but at that time, no vaccines had been approved for use in Canada or anywhere else for that matter. And there were a lot of questions and uncertainty about how quickly a vaccine could be developed based on our history of developing new pharmaceuticals and vaccines and approved without compromising Canada's high standards for safety, efficacy, and quality, which we all applaud. A lot has changed since then, of course. There are 4 COVID-19 vaccines approved for use in Canada today, and the vaccine rollout is moving very quickly. Right now, Canada leads the world in the share of national population that has received at least one COVID-19 vaccination. I feel a need to do a little hurrah. As of July 3rd, more than 75% of eligible Canadians have received their first dose, and more than 35% of the eligible population has been fully vaccinated with 2 doses. What hasn't changed is that there are still a lot of questions and some uncertainty. How well do the vaccines currently available protect against the COVID variants that we're hearing so much about in the news? Are we close to this thing called herd immunity? And what is that actually? And what's the likelihood of a 4th wave in Canada? There's so much that we still don't know, even though we're making remarkable progress. For this webinar, we've assembled a fantastic expert panel to provide clear answers to these questions and any other questions you'd like to raise during the course of this fireside chat. So let me introduce you to your speakers. Dr. Dion Neame is the North American Senior Medical Expert in Vaccines with Sanofi here in Canada. Dr. Alexander Wong, next below him, is an infectious disease physician with the Saskatchewan Health Authority and an assistant professor in the School of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. And finally, rounding out the panel is Kaili Levesque, Vice President of the COVID-19 rollout at the Public Health Agency of Canada. For this webinar, we decided to forgo our standard formal presentations and jump straight into what is often the highlight of any of our webinars, hearing directly from the panelists in a Q&A period. So you can submit your questions at any time by clicking on the Q&A little call out boxes on the bottom of your screen in Zoom in the control bar. Please let me know if you want your question to be directed to one of our panelists specifically, or if it's just a general question that we can pose to the full panel. When we get your questions ready, I'll get the ball rolling by asking each of the panelists to answer a couple of questions. So let's start with Dr. Dion Neame. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? What makes you an expert in this area?
Oh, thanks very much for having me, first of all. So I'm a pediatrician by training. I'm from McMaster Children's Hospital. And in the early days of being a pediatrician, I actually did a fellowship in primary prevention of disease. And so that led into vaccines. And I was doing a lot of research at that time because there was new vaccines coming. There was Prevnar, there was pneumococcal vaccines, there was varicella vaccines, then came the HPV vaccines, the more meningococcal vaccines, and more and more and more and more. And then I sort of had a turn after about a decade of doing that. And I wanted to know a little bit more. I wanted to know a bit more about the development of vaccines, the manufacturing of vaccines. And so I actually jumped into industry. I do 4 days a week with industry, and 1 day a week I still do pediatric urgent care. But in that role, now senior medical expert, thanks for introducing me as that, I've learned about these different aspects of it. And so I feel a little bit more comfortable talking about vaccines and the different types of vaccines. And that's what I hope to do today.
Terrific, thank you. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions and then I'm going to go to the next panel members. And in the meantime, we're going to ask our participants to start populating the Q&A box with their questions. So given your history, long history now working in vaccines outside of and including COVID-19, what's your answer if someone were to come up to you on the street and say, are COVID-19 vaccines really the answer to the pandemic? How would you respond?
Well, I would definitely say they're a big piece of the puzzle. There's no doubt about that. But when we're looking at kind of the ecosystem of what we could do in regard to prevention or actually therapeutics in vaccines, we have to look at both angles. I mean, when you look at prophylaxis, there are vaccines, and that's what we call active immunization, but that takes a little bit of a while to get sorted out. But there's also passive immunization as well, which was actually sort of at the forefront of vaccines about 100 years ago here in the Toronto area, where we were developing antibodies against diphtheria and tetanus, but you also can develop antibodies to COVID-19. So before vaccines are available, you can give antibodies, or even after vaccines available, if there happens to be a breakthrough case, you can give passive antibodies as well too. And then on the other side, the therapeutics, which maybe unfortunately we didn't have as much luck as we had thought we would in the early days last year. The therapeutics, we were hoping for antivirals. Now, we weren't making antivirals specifically for SARS-CoV-2, but what we were doing is we were taking already licensed antivirals and trying to see if they would work. And unfortunately, maybe we didn't have as much luck as we thought we would. And then there's kind of the immunosuppressive drugs, particularly for the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which if it gets into a place where it can really generate a strong response in the immune system, we can get into like acute respiratory distress syndrome. And in that regard, we're talking about maybe reducing our immune system response. So they've got general anti-inflammatory steroids, medications like dexamethasone, which seem to work quite well. But then you also have specifics, specifically looking at maybe blocking one arm of the immune system, like the interleukin pathways. Interleukin 6 pathway was the one that sort of became most popular, and two medications, tocilizumab and sarilumab. So I think it's really important that we have vaccines, obviously, and it's going to take us a long way. But I think if we had time and we had known, we would have looked at more of the, as I say, the ecosystem of the different antiviral type medications or medications for our immune system.
That's an incredible history of experience professionally and with vaccine development. You talk about going back almost 100 years in this space, and Canada providing some real leadership in this space. Can you tell me a little bit about your perception of whether there's any lessons to be learned through, the application of best practices, or what we've learned as vaccines have been developed, quite quickly relative to that process historically? Can we apply that? What's been learned, and can we apply that? Should we apply that going forward?
Yeah, well, I would say that we did get a bit lucky here with SARS-CoV-2. And the reason I'm saying that is because we had SARS-CoV-1 here in Toronto and Hamilton area. In 2002, 2003. The company I'm working with right now, Sanofi, actually did try to prepare a vaccine for SARS-CoV-1. Now, thankfully, it just disappeared on its own. But we already had the experience that most likely a vaccine was going to be prepared using the antigen, the spike protein. And they had already gone into preclinical trials and human phase 1, phase 2 trials. So when SARS-CoV-2 came along, we had already been prepared. And that's really a lot of the reason why we jumped in on all the vaccines, which are basically providing a spike protein, depending on the way they do it, whether it be an mRNA or whether it be actually providing the protein, they still do that. So I think the lesson learned there is if you are prepared, then you're going to have a faster response. So I think that, what should we do? Maybe I'll give 3 of my ideas, and certainly anyone else wants to jump in. But I think that the key thing is surveillance. I mean, if you think about from SARS-CoV-1, which I talked about, that was 2002, 2003. We've had a pandemic in 2009 with influenza H1N1. We've had Zika, Ebola, MERS, and now we've got SARS-CoV-2. So maybe we should look at that and say, okay, well, that's an infectious disease that might actually become a pandemic. Why don't we start working on it? Why don't we put our R&D brains on that and see if we can find maybe an antigen, just in case, it goes from an epidemic to a pandemic. And then the other thing I think we've learned, and the government of Canada has really been very supportive of this. Is actually looking at local manufacturing sites. I think that we've realized that as gracious as many countries might be, when you get your back against the wall, it seems like you do take care of yourself before you take care of others. And so I think that it would be a strategic plan to have local manufacturing in Canada, here in Canada, maybe in multiple different sites as well.
Great, thank you. And the one thing that I take away amongst all the three things at the end that you've added is we've been ready. We did some pre-testing. So if it feels like this really started 18 months ago, probably didn't. It started before then to develop knowledge and expertise, understanding mRNA and et cetera, some of the other options that could be tested. So there was a bit of a running start. It wasn't start from zero.
Definitely running start for sure. That's a great way of looking at it.
Okay, terrific. Thanks. I'm going to turn to Dr. Alexander Wong now. So, Alex, let's start with a bit of your background. I understand that you're part of an interdisciplinary team that provides specialized care to people in southern Saskatchewan with infectious diseases, including COVID-19. Can you tell me a little bit about your professional life in that regard?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity and for the invite. I'm an infectious disease physician, and I worked here in southern Saskatchewan in Regina for close to a decade now. After completing training, predominantly my postgrad training was done in Edmonton, and I completed medical school in London, Ontario. So my shtick, sort of the stuff that I do when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, is really around sort of bloodborne infections, HIV, viral hepatitis in more marginalized, sort of chaotic populations. I also do sort of the full scope of addictions medicine practice as well, and provide general ID care as well as internal medicine care. When COVID kind of started, obviously everything kind of completely got flipped on its side, and so we've really pivoted to try to respond to COVID. And the last few months, at least, I've also tried to take a slightly more public-facing role, doing more media, social media, and so forth, to try to provide more sort of factual, evidence-based advice and support for the general public around all matters related to COVID, including COVID-19 vaccines.
That's terrific. So one of the questions that I suspect you get asked a lot is, what do I do if I received an AstraZeneca vaccine as my first dose, but my second dose is going to be something other? Maybe it would be the Pfizer-BioNTech or the Moderna vaccine. If I have a choice, does it matter? Or is just getting the second dose the most important thing for people to think about?
Sure. So, the evidence base has evolved dramatically over the course of the last month and a half, 2 months in regards to this question. The short answer at this point is I think it's pretty concrete advice that an mRNA vaccine as a second dose is preferred if you have had, a vector vaccine like AstraZeneca as your first dose. And the reasoning for that is because of a variety of different studies that have been completed, and sort of some have been actually published now in the peer-reviewed literature. Others are still preprints showing that basically a first dose of AstraZeneca followed by a second dose of mRNA, specifically Pfizer, although we would consider the two mRNA vaccines to basically be equivalent and interchangeable, that when you follow AstraZeneca with an mRNA vaccine, that you get neutralizing antibody titers that are much higher than when you just take 2 doses of AstraZeneca alone. And so, again, there's no clinical efficacy data per se. Nobody's going to run large clinical trials at this point to show efficacy, but based on sort of the correlates of protection, antibody, and neutralizing titers that we see, with mixing and matching sort of a first dose of AstraZeneca and a second dose of Pfizer/mRNA, that looks to be the preferred option. And at the same time, avoiding a second dose of AstraZeneca also avoids this risk of these VITT clots, which have been well described in the past. So that's kind of where the current guidance is. For individuals that want to take a second dose of AstraZeneca, for example, if you're someone that likes the idea of using a second dose based on sort of clinical efficacy data, or maybe you didn't have side effects or something with your first dose of AstraZeneca, second dose of AstraZeneca still provides excellent protection against all of the variants of concern, especially particularly with regards to severe illness, hospitalizations, and deaths. So it is critically important to get a second dose regardless of what you choose.
Terrific. So if I were to summarize that terrific explanation, the typical clinical trials that would look at clinical efficacy of vaccines haven't been done to really look at the comparison of AstraZeneca versus an mRNA vaccine, but they are being monitored in the environment, and we are seeing evidence that they offer potentially an even greater benefit than two of the same vaccine. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah, again, it's very reasonable to look at these immunogenicity studies, sort of essentially like antibody titer studies, as appropriate sort of correlates of protection. And again, the challenge is trying to run large clinical trials, with limited to no funding or support. I mean, again, all the phase 3 stuff that sort of came out, with all of the various vaccines that have been approved, were all sort of funded by industry and pharma. And again, trying to pull all of those types of studies together is not impossible, but it's not going to be simple to recruit thousands and thousands of people in an evolving landscape. So, the same goes for sort of data that we have with younger kids and individuals. There's not going to be clinical efficacy data, right? We're going to be looking at immunogenicity data and antibody levels specifically in kids under 12, and that's going to be used as the basis for approval by the various regulatory bodies.
Thank you. That's terrific. So we've been following the news obviously very carefully and looking at some parts of the world, and in fact some parts of Canada, starting to think about lifting restrictions. And I'm sure you, as a frontline healthcare provider, couldn't be happier that the pandemic is starting to ease, given what's happened for the past 15 to 18 months. Can you walk us through what you think the end of the pandemic might look like for us? So how will we know when we're starting to approach it? Are we there yet?
We're definitely not there yet, but vaccines, I think, are truly our ticket out. And again, I mean, the real world data around vaccines has just been extraordinary. Vaccines have been like a miracle story, better than anything that we could have actually even expected, basically, when we saw the initial clinical efficacy data, for example, back, sort of late last year with the mRNA vaccines, Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna. They proved to be even better than we could have possibly imagined. So, I think the end of the pandemic, at least here in our sort of developed world setting, is going to be when, we're not talking and thinking and basing all of our decision making around the pandemic and COVID-19 on a day-to-day basis. And we're already starting to see some of that happen now. Alberta obviously has removed masking mandates, so has BC. Saskatchewan's going to follow suit this Sunday. And so, things continue to evolve. And I think the overall sense that most people have is that enough of the Canadian population has been vaccinated and fully vaccinated such that it's unlikely, not impossible, but it's very unlikely at this point that we're going to see significant surges, which are going to really threaten, critical care and hospital capacity. And that's really kind of the thing that we care about more than anything else. There's definitely going to be a surge in cases with Delta, and we know that Delta predominantly affects, individuals who are unvaccinated. We're starting to see that, for example, in parts of the US. So it's definitely not over. At the same time, obviously, everybody is tired. So there's this balance that needs to be struck, I think, between sort of, again, maintaining a certain degree of diligence and precautions. For example, making an individual level decision or a family level decision, for example, to continue to mask, for example, in indoor public spaces, regardless of whether or not a mandate exists. To me, for example, makes sense as someone that's more risk averse. At the same time, vaccines have been amazing, and we continue to obviously work really hard to try to, optimize both sort of first dose and second dose uptake.
So last question, then I'm going to turn to Kaili. So you talked about enough people having been vaccinated that it's not much of a concern now. So I think you're referring to herd immunity. Can you just describe what that is? And it sounds like it's more than achievable. We might already be close or there.
Yeah, this is a bit of a contentious subject. And, I think, again, most experts like immunologists, virologists, people who are like way smarter than a dumb clinician like me would imply that, that the virus is going to be endemic. It's going to circulate indefinitely and probably forever. And, what I didn't really say when I answered the last question was obviously the pandemic is not and by any means over at a global level. There's massive surges happening, for example, right now in Latin and South America, as well as Africa. And unless, we do better in this space in terms of supporting vaccine equity, across the world, we're going to continue to struggle with variants and sort of, this ongoing sort of angst. With all that said, to answer your question about herd immunity, at the end of the day, truly, I mean, people right now are framing the decision to be vaccinated as either get vaccinated or don't get vaccinated. And I think, with Delta and more transmissible variants coming to the fore, it really is going to become more of a question of like, how do you want to develop immunity to this virus? Like, do you want to get vaccinated, or do you want to basically not get vaccinated, eventually get infected and develop natural immunity and recover, or, hopefully that's the case, or potentially have a bad outcome, right? And so that's the reality we're really looking at which point, we might be at a point where we're going to have significant herd immunity in place. And so the US, I think, is a harbinger of all of this. They've had much more natural infection, frankly, than we have here in Canada. Their vaccine uptake obviously has not been as good as ours, but their overall natural immunity is probably higher than ours at a country level. So, they'll sort of be, again, a bit of a bellwether for what's going to happen here.
Terrific. Thank you very much. So I'm going to turn to you, Kaili, as our final panelist. With your senior responsibilities in the COVID-19 vaccine rollout, I mean, I can't imagine how exhausting the hours, but then the excitement to see how far we've come must be very rewarding. As we start to think about the pandemic easing, and we hear in the media stories about borders potentially opening, people wanting to travel, vaccine passports, can you tell me a little bit about what's being done to address the issue of vaccinated travelers?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Heather. And if Alex is nothing but a clinician, as a public policy person, you're really stuck with me on these answers. I will say it is exhilarating, and it's been quite the roller coaster. And you never know what new challenge is going to face us as we tackle both COVID-19, but also the rollout on a daily basis. The question of vaccinated travelers is really a live one, as you know, with yesterday having been the latest in the series of announcements. Dr. Tam likes to talk about layers of public health measures and what the appropriate layers are at any given time in response to the epidemiological context, but also as the population goes from a naive, unvaccinated population into one that is increasingly vaccinated. And what that does is it changes the quantum and the types of layers or the volume of layers that you need to apply at any point in time. So the very latest, as of yesterday, is that all travelers, including people with right of entry into Canada, are subject to the Quarantine Act. This is just one of our tools that prior to this pandemic was not a heavily used tool at the Public Health Agency of Canada. And my colleagues who work on that file are working around the clock as well, as you can imagine. So as of July 5th, fully vaccinated travelers who have right of entry into Canada will no longer be subject to quarantine if they are fully vaccinated. Or take a day 8 test. We are still testing upon arrival because it's important from a public health perspective, tracking potential vaccine escape, or understanding as variants of concern emerge, where they are around the world. I'm going to have to learn the whole Greek alphabet soon as variants keep happening. And so it's really about understanding the impact of vaccines on our traveling population. And so to be considered fully vaccinated at this point in time, a traveler must have received a full series of a Health Canada authorized vaccine at least 14 days prior to entry. As we've talked about, those vaccines that are authorized in Canada right now are the Pfizer-BioNTech, as you've mentioned, Moderna, the AstraZeneca/Covishield from the Serum Institute of India, and the Janssen, which is manufactured by Johnson & Johnson. So as we see these entry numbers, and we're watching closely to see how the vaccinated travelers are arriving. We're also, as the Prime Minister has talked about, working to develop a proof of vaccination credential to allow people leaving Canada to demonstrate their vaccination status internationally as they leave Canada. We're keen to ensure we're working with international partners on this. We want to have alignment and interoperability. So we're looking at standards at the World Health Organization, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and really understanding how that will operate. Another point I just wanted to flag on that is, given that provinces and territories do hold the jurisdiction for health and health data, we have been working very closely with them. We have the jurisdiction over borders and travel. and then they have the jurisdiction over health and health data. So this is really a joint effort, as have all things been in response to the pandemic. And so it allows that close interoperability with international countries, but also within Canada and with Indigenous partners as well as we move forward. So the current, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
I was just going to say the last piece in our current measures, the interim solution that we are leveraging is the ArriveCan app. So for 2 weeks in a row, we've been the #1 downloaded app in the Apple Store. So it shows you the level of interest and enthusiasm that Canadians have always historically shown for travel. We are a country of travelers and the richness that comes from that. And so we've seen high uptake on the ArriveCan app as those that do meet that definition of fully vaccinated can upload an interim proof of vaccination. So depending on your province or territory where you reside and were vaccinated, you can show I'm in Ontario, and so I have a little Ontario email that shows the Trillium and my vaccination status, and so then you would be able to upload that to the ArriveCan app, and then what we're looking at as well as developing a higher fidelity, to use the technical term, but just really a more data-rich technological solution as opposed to a photograph, and so that would be to support outbound travel, and that's what we're working towards now. So this is something that we are continuing to advance. Right now is still not the time to travel bolus internationally. We're looking to support Canadians to safe travel around the world. And we'll be ready to support them in that in those efforts. Thanks.
I think I can hear people cheering remotely for the possibility to get back out and see the world again and see parts of Canada. So thank you for all the work that you and the team are doing to make that a possibility. One of the questions that we've heard in preparing for this second webinar on vaccines is, really the process of developing vaccines, we've proven that it was been faster than we've ever really experienced, even though we talked about at the beginning with Dion's comments that there was a start with the SARS-CoV-1 vaccine. So it wasn't quite as quick as we might have thought. There was some pre-work. The speed then raises questions about effectiveness and monitoring for adverse events. Can you just talk the audience through what Health Canada, what the government is doing to monitor vaccine effectiveness and adverse events following immunization?
Absolutely. And if you had told me a year ago that I would be, as I was negotiating with vaccine manufacturers, that I'd be sitting here fully vaccinated telling you what we're doing next, I would never have believed you. So it's just wonderful. And I can't speak volumes enough for the science that goes behind this and the work of Health Canada, the Public Health Agency of Canada, and all of the provinces and territories as we watch for any of those safety signals, any adverse events. And so, as it starts from the very beginning, where Health Canada works very closely with the manufacturers, and in the pandemic has done so in an unprecedented, at an unprecedented speed, but also in terms of closeness in alignment, evaluating the data from clinical trials to determine if it's safe and efficacious and whether it is ready or can be authorized for use in Canada. And then once a vaccine is in use, health authorities continue to monitor that vaccine on an ongoing basis to ensure the highest standards of safety. So once it is on the market, we watch for adverse events after immunization. And some of these are very routine, I had a headache, after my second dose, my arm hurt for a couple of days. I'm sure others have experienced these as well. And then some of them are on the more serious side. And as you do see, we do report these publicly, and they're through the Canadian Adverse Events Following Immunization Surveillance System. So that is actually reported publicly. These are reported on a weekly basis to the Public Health Agency of Canada, and we watch those to continuously confirm, review, make sure that the authorized vaccines continue to be safe. And that is complemented by the Canada Vigilance Program, which is Health Canada's post-market surveillance program. So we've got both the practitioners on the ground monitoring and also the companies themselves on the vigilance side. So it is actually a really great partnership because it gives you the bottom-up and top-down approach, and it allows us to monitor that safety profile as it's out in the world. And both we get great news in terms of effectiveness in the real world, but also making sure that we're monitoring what the impacts are in the real world. So manufacturers are responsible for reporting. They must report any serious adverse reactions, unexpected serious adverse effects, also in other countries. So not just in Canada, but we're also watching that internationally, and they do report into the Health Canada program, as I mentioned. The other thing that Health Canada does, in addition to working with the manufacturers, is also monitor all the ongoing, because once a vaccine's out, there's still post-trial safety work that's happening in the companies. So they continue to provide real world data to Health Canada as well, and could include warning Canadians about potential side effects, changing the recommended use of the product, or even removing the product from the market. So far, you've seen Health Canada adjust a couple of the product monographs in response. The VITT was mentioned by Dr. Wong, but that has maintained it maintains that constant presence. The final thing I just wanted to say was the role that the medical community plays in this as well, beyond the parameters of the Public Health Agency of Canada, working with the National Advisory Committee on Immunization. And that's an external body that includes experts in the field of pediatrics, infectious disease, immunology, pharmacy, nursing, epidemiology, pharmacoeconomics, which I did not know about until I was responsible for this file, social sciences and public health. So it's a really cross multidisciplinary team. And what they do is they provide us with independent advice on the optimal use. So I'm sure you've all seen the co-chairs appear before the media or be asked questions, can you explain this? The NACI guidance on the use and application of vaccines. And they review the same clinical trial data as Health Canada, but then they also bring public health strategies and context to bear on that and how they make their recommendations, and they watch it as it changes. They can issue addenda, additions, modifications as the evidence continues to emerge, as Dr. Wong so eloquently put it.
That's terrific. And I was going to say, as you just led into that last piece, that we've already begun to see some of those changes and modifications being made, which is some, good evidence of the responsiveness of the system. So I'm going to turn to something that I know is on people's minds, and it's we all very, very excited about where we are, the commitment, the progress that we've made. But we've heard people talk about the level of protection that one vaccine dose might provide in terms of protecting against variants of concern, or VOCs. So with fears of them spreading, I think a new one that was in the media yesterday. So these, as you said earlier, you'll have to know the whole Greek alphabet by the time the pandemic is truly eased. Can you talk a little bit about what the government is doing to promote second dose uptake? We're about 35%, I think, at the whole population of being double vaccinated. So what's being done to get those numbers even higher?
Absolutely, and thank you for that. So second dosing is going to be, the enthusiasm and unbridled commitment the Canadians have shown to getting out there and getting vaccinated. The enthusiasm, we want to bottle that up and keep it going as the second dose strategies come to bear. We've seen it grow by leaps and bounds, even just in the last few weeks. If you had followed on the vaccine tracker, even just 3 weeks ago, I think we were at about 11% of the population that was second dosed, and now, as you say, we're well over the 35% range. So that commitment is there. We're seeing it through, but we know that it's not just enough to just put it out there. It's not a field of dreams scenario. If you build it, they will come. Some will come, but some need some nudging and reminders to get back to come get that second dose. So for us, we have a variety of levers at the federal level. We have the Immunization Partnerships Fund, which is a grants and contribution program where we're currently supporting over 30 projects across the country, directed at all different levels of populations that we're targeting, from healthcare providers, education and awareness, equity deserving groups, communities that express greater vaccine hesitancy or barriers to vaccination. Again, those layers of public health, there's also barriers that you want to remove along the way. And we are also looking at constantly understanding where there might be emerging pockets of hesitancy as well. So it's not just a static process. We also work actively to provide healthcare provider education and training in addition. So we've, since December, we've had over 25 webinars aimed at improving healthcare knowledge and core competencies related to COVID-19 vaccination. They've had significant reach, and we've had over 43,000 views at each individual event. So when you start to think about the ripple effects that has of having that many participants at each event. And then what we've done as well is we've worked, Public Health Agency has been working with other federal departments to maximize the reach of their own vaccine competence initiatives. And one that we're particularly proud of has been the work with Indigenous Services Canada. We've worked with them to develop a COVID-19 vaccination communication toolkit intended specifically for Indigenous communities, which have helped promote and disseminate through our monthly vaccine bulletin, and it reaches over 100 organizations and networks across the country as well. And it's been a new way to reach stakeholders, reach partners, and just try to ensure that ongoing, clear, robust communications with Canadians around the broader suite that we have of vaccine communications, marketing, advertising efforts. And what it really does in those is really help promote vaccine uptake, increase transparency around the entirety of the rollout, and build trust so that, there is a constant narrative that is clear that helps counter both misinformation and disinformation. We are watching carefully. We've seen other countries reach plateaus in those second dose strategies. Israel had challenged with that, and so had we've seen the US struggle with some second dose strategies. And so what we've been doing is we're trying to be as creative as possible, but we're also talking to other countries as well so that they know what do we know? How can we share that information? What was extremely helpful in getting over those hurdles? So we get together with all of our provincial and territorial partners on a regular basis to talk about these, but we also bring in representatives from industry, Indigenous groups, and international partners to just try to really make those strategies as timely and resonant as possible.
What an incredible set of linkages that we've made in Canada to other countries, other people. I was just thinking about your comment that you had 43,000 people over 25 webinars. My mental math is pretty bad, but my calculator says that's more than 1 million people. You set a new target for our webinars here at CADTH. So thanks very much to all three of our panelists. We're now going to open it up for questions. So we have 55 questions in the Q&A box. I am going to try and clump them together as best I can. There will be some we won't get to today, unfortunately, but thank you for putting them in. We'll certainly send our panelists a list of the questions, because if you're thinking about them, other people are thinking about them, and if we can answer them, maybe we can start to continue with that second dose, encouragement and having information, not disinformation or misinformation. So I think the first one I'm going to pick on and I pick out from the list of questions, and I think it's probably Dion and Kaili that would answer, is can you advise on the use of boosters, especially for immunocompromised patients? Do we know enough about if that's going to be necessary? And if so, how will we know and when will we know?
So maybe I'll start with that. So the immunocompromised person is always very difficult because that's a broad array of people, and people are partially, moderately, or severely immunocompromised. So when you're giving immunizations to those folks, it can be very challenging. We do have immunogenicity kind of guidelines of where we've seen people that have normal immune systems and after 2 doses where they land at certain times after the vaccination. So we can look at that as kind of a benchmark. But we haven't looked at enough information yet in the immunocompromised group to understand whether they're going to need 1 dose, 2 dose, 3 dose, and we have to just keep following that. A lot of that has to do with the fact that most of the vaccines were under the emergency use authorization. So the package of data that we took to BRDD it was much smaller than it would have been normally, and so this is like ongoing research as we move forward.
And if I may add, this is, what we're working on in real time. We're watching. You've seen different announcements about timing. The CEO of Pfizer at one point had said, "Oh, it's definitely 9 months," and now we've seen some others that have said, "Well, maybe 6 months." The UK publicly stated they're working on a 6-month interval. So we're aggregating all of that in real time and working with suppliers on, what could potentially be that perfect mix, and looking at the WHO even speculated, I think it was Monday, saying, well, if you're a healthier human, perhaps you only need them every 2 years. So we're trying to take that all into account, working with futures that don't yet exist, but we're really working closely with suppliers to both understand the parameters and have access to those second generation vaccines or boosters, as it may be. As you may have seen, the Prime Minister did announce an agreement with Pfizer back in April for doses in 2022 and 2023. And so we continue to work on this with our partners, but also with our expert advisors to really make sure that we continue to have a robust and diverse portfolio. We've been really fortunate to date in how the science has played out and how the companies have played out. And so we're keeping that eye as we move forward.
Great, thank you. So stay tuned, I think is the short answer. That's terrific. That sounds like we're already preparing as a country to have product available when that answer is ready. So Alex, I'm going to turn the next question to you. As a frontline clinician that sees patients every day, what do you think we've learned around risk communication and COVID vaccines? How can we, do you think, improve communication in the short term to maybe address vaccine hesitancy?
It's been a very evolving thing, and let's face it. I mean, the communication picture around vaccinations in general, like with COVID, could definitely have been done much better. And at the end of the day, I think part of this is just the consequences of, again, people who don't necessarily have, time to prepare, and are basically going and taking very public facing roles, and stuff just kind of comes, right? And so what the reality is that when it comes to communicating any of this stuff is that you do have to kind of be very deliberate in terms of thinking about what the key messaging needs to be, and sort of doing it again in a very deliberate way, as opposed, and a thoughtful way, as opposed to just kind of shooting off the cuff. And so, a lot of the stuff that I've done, like for TV and radio and national, all this other stuff, it's all live. So, sometimes you get thrown curveballs and stuff. And again, I mean, you need to sort of have this kind of thoughtful process before you go on screen and do this, to really understand what it is in terms of the messaging that you want to get across. And if you don't, or if, you just are thrown a bit of a curveball, and then you, for example, make a comment, or use the example, for example, of encouraging your family member to get AstraZeneca and then never being able to live with yourself if she were to have like a life-threatening clot, that obviously is messaging which it's accurate, but at the same time, it's not optimal in terms of encouraging people, to get vaccine. The focus has to be on, sort of emphasizing the key benefits, while at the same time, talking about the risks, but putting them in the right sort of, context in terms of risk versus benefit. Human beings are not great at measuring risk and benefit in general. We do a lousy job of it in our day-to-day lives. And that's something that, we do every day as frontline clinicians, is make clinical judgments based on risks and benefits. And the best clinicians are the ones who actually have the ability to actually think this through in a very explicit way, and even better, actually explain it to patients and family members and loved ones around what are the risks and what are the benefits. So that's what we've tried to do over the course of the last number of months. And there's been obviously a group of experts, who have been very, very effective and have come to the fore. And, thankfully for all of them, they've been effective in terms of this kind of messaging.
Terrific, thank you. So the next question I'm going to direct to you, Dion, but Alex, if you want to comment on it, if you do see this population, please feel free. So with, particularly with your background as a pediatrician, what's your thinking about what COVID vaccines for children, kids under the age of 12 might look like in the next year?
Yeah, I mean, so quite well that we're down to 12 now. And Pfizer was at 16, and now they've published data down to 12, and the recommendations are made that people can get over 12, but under 12, so it'll be 6 months to 11 years. They are in fact doing studies right now. Alex, I think, mentioned just a little bit before, though, that this is mainly going to be immunogenicity studies. So they'll be bridging. So they'll look at the antibody titer levels, and they'll see if they achieve or are higher than people 12 years of age and older. Children, as we know, do not suffer the same way that certainly the elderly population does with COVID. There's many sort of postulated reasons why, but in the end, they don't. But there are some unusual events that occur, one of being the multisystem inflammatory syndrome. This is something that we do tend to see with viral infections, and it's not during the infection, it's actually after the infection. And what they speculate, and what we sort of know and speculate, but the antibodies that are produced against SARS-CoV-2, in fact, actually get a little stupid, and they start attacking our cells and our own end organs. And so this is where you start to get these types of the multi-system effects, and they can infect vital organs as well too. So that's a little bit tricky and dangerous. And then of course there is kind of the long-term effects of SARS-CoV-2, which people are starting to talk about now, and they are there's quite an array of them, from the lungs, the heart, neuropsychiatric, endocrine, renal, and thrombotic. So I think that we're going to, again, as Alex has mentioned, we're going to look at benefit and risk. The mRNA vaccines particularly their safety profile looks excellent. And with that, and with the fact that you can have the risk of having bad outcomes, even though they may be more rare than adults with children, I would suggest that the benefit and the risk would be to actually get vaccinated once we have that immunological data available from Pfizer, and then certainly soon to be Moderna as well.
Alex, is there anything you'd want to add to that?
No, I think Dion pretty much hit it all. I mean, the only other thing, obviously, that has come up the last couple of months has been this issue around heart inflammation and episodes of pericarditis and myocarditis associated with mRNA vaccine, predominantly in people getting second doses, mostly in men under 30, although there are women and people over the age of 30 who are also getting this. This has been studied reasonably thoroughly at this point. The US obviously released a lot of data just, I think, a week and a half ago. Sort of CDC did their review, ACIP did their review. And I think it's still pretty clear at this point that benefits exceed risk. There's still a lot of unknowns, as Dion mentioned, around things like long COVID in children and so forth. And so, I feel confident and comfortable clinically, and sort of, again, I mean, when you look in the entire sort of world, there's obviously differing opinions on how all of this should go. But I think the overall prevailing consensus, which makes sense from people who are intelligent and reasonable, is that, when vaccines become available for children under the age of 12, that you should definitely go and get fully vaccinated as quickly as possible.
Thank you. And so interesting, the myocarditis and pericarditis issue has popped up in a number of questions in the chat function. So thank you for responding to that. So I'm going to ask you, Dion, to just, because you're a pediatrician and I find pediatricians can explain anything to anybody, no matter how complicated it is. So can you pretend that we're all 5 and you're trying to explain efficacy, effectiveness of vaccines to people? Tell it to us so we can tell it to other people.
Well, efficacy is something that is related to a randomized control study. And you have to understand, in the randomized control study, they're trying to make everything perfect. You're being called by clinical research assistants every week. You're being asked questions, you're being fielded questions, you're being followed along the line of the entire program. So efficacy is a statistic that will show you how well the vaccine will work in a vaccinated population, which is virtually identical to a non-vaccine population. So the only factor that's different is that vaccine. And the end outcome simply is case index. So in the vaccinated group, how many people got the disease? And in the unvaccinated group, how many people got the disease? And then there'll be a percentage. And that's where you get the 95% from Moderna and from Pfizer. Now, effectiveness is what happens in the real world. It's not perfect anymore. Now you have people who may show up maybe a little late for their vaccine. Now you have people that may not show up at all for the second dose. Now you've got people that they may have been excluded in the randomized control study, and now they're not, because it's real life. And so you tend to see that, although it's the same, people that are vaccinated versus people that aren't vaccinated in regard to that number, but you tend to see that number, the effectiveness going down somewhat. For example, you would say, were people that were in long-term care, were they studied in the Pfizer and Moderna? They weren't. So, but will they have a 95% efficacy? Most likely not, because they're older, their immune systems don't work as well, a bit dysfunctional, and so they may even have an 80% effectiveness. So they're different terms. One's the randomized control, perfect situation, and the other one, that efficacy and the effectiveness, is the real world, how well it works in the real world.
See, that's exactly why I asked you. Thank you very much. So the next question, I'm going to direct it to Kaili first, and then ask the other panel members if they want to speak up to the issue. Canada was criticized early for not having vaccine production facilities. So we're to some extent, a mercy of the supply chain and supply chain disruptions. We do have a couple of companies in Canada that have production facilities, for example. Are these production facilities, did they need to be ramped up? Do we need more of them? So how do we get around the issue of really having vaccine supply in the country and supporting industry to have that kind of manufacturing facility and production facility at the ready?
Thanks. And I will say, while we did pursue obviously a procurement-driven approach, an international procurement-driven approach to the vaccine portfolio, this was coupled with early-stage investments to help advance Canada's biomanufacturing capacity. So it was a bit of, we'll buy for now and we'll invest in tandem for the future. So there's been some, remarkable Canadian companies in the biomanufacturing space that have demonstrated abilities to mobilize quickly in response to the pandemic. And the government has made investments in some of those companies to advance industrial research in vaccines, pharmaceuticals, but also in the broader biomanufacturing capacity through my colleagues at the Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development. They have a strategic innovation fund, and a few in particular, they've invested in CABS Laboratories Incorporated, which will produce monoclonal antibody therapies, Novacal Pharmaceutical of Canada to expand biomanufacturing facility, Immune Biosolutions to help develop and advance therapeutic candidates to phase 2. And in addition, earlier this year, Minister Haidu, Minister of Health, along with the Minister of Industry, announced an investment of up to $415 million to support Sanofi Pasteur Limited in building up an end-to-end influenza vaccine manufacturing facility in Toronto in partnership with the Government of Ontario. So as I say, it's a bit of both hands and making sure that we have them today, but also looking at the future as well. Thanks.
Dion first and then Alex.
I think that, Canada has been just an incredible player in the game of biotech over the last over 100 years. I mean, at the site that I'm on in Toronto, we had John Fitzgerald, producing antibodies initially for diphtheria and tetanus, and then went on to produce the first vaccines. Toronto and Hamilton were the first two cities in the world back in the 20s and 30s who were actually diphtheria free. In that same time frame in the 20s, University of Toronto with Best in Banting discovered insulin. And then there was manufacturing through it. We were very instrumental in the polio vaccine. We actually, in regard to smallpox, we figured out a manufacturing way to what's called freeze-dry or lyophilize smallpox vaccine, so it was eradicated around the world. We also, at this time, we not talking about Sanofi, but other companies, we've got a lot of companies, for example, they've got GSK and Medicago that are doing a lot of work in regard to vaccines here. I mean, because they happen to be not doing the work for coronavirus, well, that's one thing. But if we had a pandemic for influenza, we would have been we would have production facilities in several different places in Canada. I will say that I think that, and I'm seeing that Canada is becoming a bit of a biotech power. When you look at the big cities like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, let alone the universities, we are starting to escalate like no one's business. We're catching up to Silicon Valley and San Francisco. And I wouldn't be surprised if we do escalate. The fact that the federal government is putting in a lot of money from just, manufacturing sites that they did with Sanofi, I think $415 million, and Ontario government put $15 million, it's huge amounts of money. And the fact is that the industry is also putting monies in. It's just great news all around. I think probably in the next 10 to 20 years, you're going to see that Canada is going to be back where it was 100 years ago, developing ahead of other countries. We just have to sort of get our ducks in order a little bit. Maybe we lost a little bit of that vigor over the 100 years, and now I think we're back in action.
Alex, anything you'd like to add?
Not really,
No.
Other than to say that we have too much vaccine and we need to support global vaccine equity. That's all.
That is a really important point. Thank you for raising that. We are an international partner and in a country in a world dealing with a global pandemic. So we're not quite out of time, but I want to give the panelists each a few minutes to just tell in their own words, what do you want our participants to take away from this? So originally we thought 30 seconds or less, but I think we've got 4 or 5 minutes left. So if you can do it in, 60 seconds or less. And I'm going to start, Alex, with you, and then Dion, and then Kaili. What would you like people to walk away from today's webinar with? What's the most important message from your perspective?
Well, vaccines work, and they work well against all variants. There's no reason to believe that sort of these new. There's Lambda variant now, for example. There's no reason to believe that if you're fully vaccinated, that they shouldn't be extremely efficacious against all of these variants that are emerging and continue to emerge going forward, particularly with the mRNA vaccines specifically. And so we all have an important role to play in regards to spreading good information, helping, people around us who have yet to be vaccinated for whatever reason. We all have an important role to play around supporting those individuals with information and with, support, logistical support, transport, whatever else the case may be, helping to get an appointment booked. All of these things, I think, again, are critically important pieces for us to try to improve both first and second dose uptake. And, if we can get that as good as it can possibly be at a countrywide level, then, we're going to see, again, surges per se, but it's going to hopefully be more of like a little bump or a ridge as opposed to the giant, massive kind of wave that we had in March, April, May, which kind of overwhelmed our systems and caused a lot of, stress and angst. So that would be my sort of take home, and try to access reliable information if you can. That's easier said than done, and I've just recently gotten into the social media space. So there are certain individuals, I think, in the social media space who sound like experts, but honestly have other agendas at play. And so being able to differentiate between good information and bad information is also critically important. So you can find me on social media. I have lots of my colleagues across Canada who can also provide a lot of help and support as well. Obviously, both provincial and federal governments provides excellent information as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Dion.
Yeah, I always get into these conversations with people, and I always have to back them up because I usually have taken me 100 days into the pandemic, and I always back them up and say, listen, there's something called the chain of infection. And the chain of infection is 6 different elements that have to be in play in order to have an infection. And that means 1, you have to have an infection. 2, you have to have a reservoir where the virus can harbor itself. It has to leave the reservoir, transmit across. It has to then be transmitted into people who have different levels of vulnerability where it will reproduce, and then it will be, stay the same, or it'll change and it'll be the infectious disease. And you kind of spin around in this cycle. The thing is that you have to have all those elements in order to have an infection, but you only have to break a chain, one link of the chain, in order to actually break it. So that could be in a situation where it could be the vaccine, or well, let's just stop for a second. The first half, or the upper half, which happens to be septal portion, the infectious disease in the reservoir, that's really where kind of the medications work, the vaccines work, the antibodies work in that. But if you get vaccinated, that's great, but let's talk about the lower section for a minute. That is preventing transmission. And just because you get your vaccine and you've got 2 doses, and maybe the country's got 35% of people with 2 doses, 65 or 70% with 1 dose, we can still play those other parts. We can still break the chain by, if you happen to be in a crowded area, maybe you should be wearing your mask until we've, 3-4 months down the road and we're a little bit more highly vaccinated. Or use respiratory etiquette, or wash your hands, and still do those types of things. So that's my message: is that there's lots of ways that you can participate and be part of the solving this SARS-CoV-2 problem, and the chain of infection is a good place to start to participate.
That's terrific. Thank you. Kaili.
Well, my first piece of advice is go follow Dr. Wong on Twitter, because I just did, and some great information in his feed. But in particular, a few things that really stick with me, both from other panelists and some of the questions, great questions in the feed, by the way, is thinking about ongoing focus on second dose uptake, but not losing sight of those first doses that we have not yet reached. So these are points we're trying to manage ourselves and others as well. Work with your communities, provide information. Even when you're on Facebook and Instagram, you'll notice that if it doesn't quite seem right, there's usually, if they mention COVID, there's usually a little place you can tap that will take you to the Government of Canada website or other reputable COVID-19 vaccine information as a way to combat misinformation. The other area where we'll be focusing big time in my efforts over my summer holidays is continued collaboration with provinces, territories, Indigenous partners. The early investments in co-creation, co-planning have really yielded fruit, as we saw vulnerable populations and Indigenous populations vaccinated early and often by getting both doses in early. Ongoing collaboration with global partners, as Alex said, looking at opportunities for dose sharing mechanisms, learning, exchanging best practices and information as we reach some of those plateaus, continue tracking and monitoring as the pandemic itself evolves. So continue to follow public health measures, thinking about those layers. When do you put them on? When do you take them off? What's a safe parameter on there? Thinking about planning ahead, and that continued engagement with Canadians more broadly. Just continues to be a collective effort. So to not be complacent at this point in our progress. Thanks.
Lots of very fabulous advice. We're at the end of our time together. I, on behalf of Kenneth and all the listeners now and on the future and YouTube, want to thank our panelists, Dr. Wong, Dr. Neame, and Kaili Levesque for joining us today. But I also want to thank, on behalf of all of us, healthcare workers, people in ministries, people in industry who have worked tirelessly since the pandemic started to put us in the enviable position of 75% or more vaccinated first dose and 35% or more second dose. We have a lot to be proud of in Canada. Thank you for joining today. Until we talk to you next time, stay safe.
Take care. Be safe.